Hello everyone, bringing you the Mannequin of the Month for September 2021 today. As usual, the topic has been picked via a poll over on Patreon. There's a poll over there each month where the topic that's going to be covered in Mannequin of the Month is chosen. And the topic chosen for this month was a British soldier jungle warfare training in the late 1970s. And this is based directly off photographs taken of troops serving out in Belize. And unfortunately can't share those because they are copyrighted and watermarked, but the mannequin in terms of the kit and so forth that's worn has been used, and it's referenced directly from those photographs. The British Army at this time period, of course, had quite extensive jungle warfare experience, and there were still men around who'd served in Malaya during the Malayan emergency, and of course in Borneo during the Indonesia-Borneo confrontation. They gained quite a lot of experience of jungle warfare. That said, the kit and equipment was only just beginning to be updated. A lot of the kit on the mannequin here would have been recognisable to men who'd served in the 1950s. Most of the 1944 pattern web equipment, in fact. The uniform, however, is updated. Up until the 1960s and the early 70s, the British Army had been using olive drab or green, olive green jungle uniform. The British Army had introduced DPM, of course, for general issue in the early 1970s. By the late 1970s, they'd rolled out a new tropical uniform made in the DPM print. The colours are quite bright. You do see colours similar to this on some of the temperate or DPM clothing that was around at the time, but certainly some items of tropical clothing were made in very, very garish, bright DPM print. So this is fairly subdued compared to some examples you'll see. The shirt is very simple. It's made of polycotton and has bellows pockets on the top here. You can see they do have an expansion gusset all the way around there, and then button down the front as well as having a zip underneath that. These are often worn tucked into the trousers. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to replicate that look on the mannequin because the tropical trousers I have, much as they fit me in the waist, it's an impossibility on the mannequin, unfortunately, even though I have shaped these down to fit smaller size uniforms. They're only polystyrene. They still can't fit the tropical trousers. They're just too small, and it would involve taking too much off the mannequin. Other things wouldn't fit properly. The web equipment would slip down and so forth. So, as I say, that's a compromise here. An interesting detail to note, much as I can't show it on the mannequin, is it's very common to see in period photographs at the time that the fly buttons were left open to allow ventilation of the trousers. Just an interesting little point to mention here. It's very common to see in period photographs. The hat worn, we should have started with that really at the top, but going back to the hat, is essentially the standard British jungle hat which had been introduced at the end of the Second World War, but now made in the same DPM polycotton material as the rest of the uniform. It does have a neck cord in here, you can see, with a plastic toggle. This is a feature which had been introduced on the preceding green hats during the 1960s. They added these little tabs here with an eyelet in them to allow for a neck cord to be fitted. So that is included in the design here. And of course the design will be perpetuated and then made in desert DPM for use in arid hot weather environments. And obviously it's still a very similar design, is still used by the British Army today, or at least until very recently. I think the examples made in MTP are of a very similar design. You have vented mesh ventilation eyelets in the side there. It's quite a ubiquitous design, and certainly set the pattern for boonie hats as they would come to be known from American terminology going forward. Moving on to the web equipment, we have here the 1944 pattern web equipment. Still in use at this time, in spite of the fact that 1958 pattern had been around for 20 years at this point, or getting on for 20 years. 1944 pattern had initially been issued out as a theatre issue in the Far East, with some units receiving issues of it as well, such as the Parachute Regiment, and to a degree the Gurkhas as well. But it was primarily intended as theatre issue. It was issued out in Malaya, it was issued out in Korea, it was issued out in Borneo, mixed in Borneo with the new 1958 pattern web equipment. However, the photographs from Belize in 1978 show the men exclusively equipped with 1944 pattern, worn in a somewhat stripped down configuration. It's quite interesting the way it was being worn in the photographs, which I've replicated here. You have the standard 1944 pattern belt. You have a mix of components here, actually, just to mention that before we get more into this. You'll notice there's different sort of levels of wear to the different components. 1944 pattern was still in production at this time period, in spite of 1958 pattern being introduced, and obviously very much the standard web equipment for other theatres. 1944 pattern was still being manufactured in the 1970s. And in the mid to late 1960s, various components of it had been modified, and the belt had been beefed up, so we have a later issue belt there. The two ammunition pouches are also of the later issue. And they have, as a modification to the design that happened in the mid-1960s, the second set of C-hooks were fitted so they can be worn low on the belt, as you see here. There are a normal set of C-hooks set down here so they can still be worn high on the belt, but these are actually being worn on the upper set, so they hang lower on the belt and actually can be worn without support. So the 1944 pattern normally has braces which clip into, obviously buckle into the pouches to support them. In this instance they aren't being used, they're just sat on the belt with no other form of support. In addition to the two ammunition pouches, we have a compass pouch at the front here, just slotted onto the belt there. That just fits on with belt loops. A bit of a squeeze at the front there, but an unfortunate feature of 1944 pattern is with the various fixtures and fittings, it's actually quite difficult to move things round on the belt. So these are set about as far round on the hips as they can be, the two ammunition pouches, without getting in the way of the other fixtures and fittings. For that reason, in some instances, these other fittings were removed, but in this instance, they're all still there on the belt. You can also see the L-straps from the haversack, the carrying straps for the haversack round here. They do have hooks on them to hook into the top of the ammunition pouches, of course, but that wasn't done in the photographs I'm referencing this from. So again, I've not done that myself. I've copied what was done at the time. It's just hanging on the L-straps on the back, much like a small rucksack. And as we'll see, the haversack is actually the initial issue, the first issue. There was an updated design around at this time, but the photographs I've seen, the men appear to be carrying the initial issue of haversack. That's the front of the mannequin. We'll move this round now and have a look at the right-hand side. Looking at the right-hand side of the mannequin here, you can see we have the features on the belt. One of the features on the belt I was talking about. We have a loop here, which would allow the stock of the rifle. It was initially intended to allow the stock of the rifle to be stabilised when carried on its sling. It was a feature that was rarely used. I've rarely seen any evidence of this in use, and it really was sort of a vestigial part of the equipment at this point, but that's been retained. It could be looped around the belt, but as I say, in some of the photographs you can clearly see this is just loose on the side. In certain instances these were also removed, but again not in the photographs I was referencing this from. The ammunition pouch here, you can see more of the design of that here with a quick release at the front there. Very large design, very voluminous, could carry a lot in those. You can also see one of the two water bottles carried around on the hip here, and the side profile of the 1944 pattern haversack on the back there. We'll get a more detailed look at these now as we move the mannequin round. Looking at the back of the mannequin here, we can see the haversack carried up on the shoulders, as we saw the L-straps before. One advantage compared to the preceding 1937 pattern equipment, which this was somewhat developed from, you could adjust the L-straps, so the straps actually have buckles and you can adjust them whilst wearing the haversack, which was a feature which hadn't previously been included in British web equipment. So it is possible to carry the haversack like this with no other form of support, just hanging on the L-straps on the shoulders. As said, this is the design of haversack initially introduced with the web equipment in the 1960s. An enlarged version had been introduced, but that isn't shown in the photographs I'm referencing this from. The men seem to be using the earlier, smaller haversack. The two side pouches here, each designed to hold a mess tin half, and very effective in that regard. You can pack things in the mess tin, and then you can carry soft kit and so forth in the main body. Rations on top, have soft kit underneath. The bit that's going to contact your back the most is a good place to put the soft kit, and then you'd be carrying ration packs and items from the ration packs and so forth in there as well. Sometimes you might see a shelter, a poncho, that sort of thing, wrapped up underneath and rolled up underneath using these straps here. But again, in the photographs I'm referencing this from, they aren't carried, so I've left those empty there. Looking at the belt here, you can see the two buckles at the rear there. As I say, this equipment does have a set of braces and it will buckle onto the belt there using those buckles, but in the photographs I'm referencing this from, it's not used, and it wasn't uncommon, certainly early in time periods in the 1950s, 1960s, for the belt to be worn like this without any form of support. So it just sits on the hips and the weight is carried on the hips by adjusting the belt in so it fits tightly enough to do that. I have two water bottles, each carried in a 1944 pattern carrier. These are the later type, introduced in the mid to late 1950s, with a rubber cap. You can see that there, they're both the later type. It's not unknown to see the earlier water bottles with a metal cap in photographs of this time period as well. They were still around, and if they were still serviceable, they would still have been issued out. But two examples with the rubber cap there. That's the back of the mannequin. Looking at the left-hand side of the mannequin here, we can see a feature of the tropical combats. You have a pen pocket worked into the arm here, and this would be perpetuated on the later Desert DPM tropical combats as well. And then underneath, you can see one of the buckles I mentioned on the L-straps for the haversack there, which allow them to be adjusted whilst the haversack's worn on the back, which means it can be carried more comfortably in this manner without any other support. And then The ammunition pouch here just shows a feature of the 1944 pattern web equipment. You have the loops on the side there which will allow a bayonet to be carried. No bayonet has been carried in this instance, so they're empty. It's a feature that would be carried across the 1958 pattern web equipment as well, and obviously used as part of that web equipment design right the way through until the end of its service. It was only very, very late on that feature was removed from 1958 pattern. And it does keep the bayonet up out of the way when one is being carried, rather than having it in a separate frog hanging around on the hip. So there we are. I hope you found it interesting looking at this. As I say, an interesting mix of the old and the new for the late 1970s. Certainly 1944 pattern, quite archaic by this time period, but many components of it would still show up for many years yet, mixed in with other web equipment. So it had a very long service life in that regard. The shirt and hat, of course, being the new tropical uniform introduced recently to the British Army at this time period. I do hope you found it interesting running through all of this. If you have, and you'd like to see more from the channel, please do consider subscribing if you haven't already. And whether you're newly subscribing or you've previously subscribed, please do make sure you hit the little bell, little notification button down below, and that will of course alert you when I upload future videos. If you'd like the opportunity to vote on what's going to be covered in Mannequin of the Month each month, and you'd like to support the channel, Patreon and PayPal are both linked down below, and of course on Patreon, the corporal tier over there, you get the opportunity to vote each month on what's going to be covered in Mannequin of the Month. If you'd like to follow the channel on social media, where there will of course be photographs of this, Facebook, Instagram and Twitter are all linked down below. And if you'd like to get in touch but you don't really use social media, there is of course an email address down below as well. That's everything for this video, so until next time, bye for now.